Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. But a bit of context: we released this research on the 12th of June, and I think the response have been very very positive around, and I'm very excited to share with you some of the detail behind it. I think if you have looked through the paper, or if you've seen the paper, you might have seen it's quite a complex and long read on this. So hopefully this could show you some detail, some light on this, and of course we open to questions at the end. So I'll take you on a little bit of a journey as to how we got to develop this paper, because I think the context is very relevant for today, because it informed. I think it's a helpful tool to advise on strategies and options available in the market. I think we're seeing a rapid adoption of renewable energy, or at least an interest. But unfortunately, given South Africa's it's only starting its transition to renewable energy, there's a lot of expertise in-house in businesses that need to be built up. And we hope really for this paper to be a input to a procurement process, or a way you analyze the pros and cons of every strategy on it. So just a little bit of context, and I'd like to start at that point, because this is the question that we asked when we were probably in exactly the same position as you, or maybe you in a few years ago, around renewable energy. And this is when we went out for our own procurement processes on this. And the question we really asked at that point in time was, why are businesses in South Africa, why is our business being offered only around about a 50% replacement of our energy with renewable energy? We went out at the time for quite a comprehensive process of getting proposals in from various providers, and different levels of due diligence on these. But one thing that was universal across all the proposals is that between 40 and 60% was really the numbers that came out. No one was able to offer us a full replacement of our renewable energy. And this is the foundation of the actual paper, to say, understand why this is the case, give an idea of how renewable energy operates in the South African market, and then importantly analyze the various strategies and how they deliver on the needs. So it is a paper that you can download if you don't have it already. We do suggest you read it. We'll be sending, or we're busy putting together a sort of executive summary on this that we can share with you. But it resulted in this white paper. So a bit of detail. We did run this white paper past various industry experts in the market, specifically on the consumer side, because I think they've got extensive experience. So we did cover. We got feedback from roughly 25% of the total electricity demand, or companies representing roughly 25% of the total electricity demand in South Africa, and that collection of companies advised us on the strategies, provided input to this, told us what to guide us on the way they think about it as well. So thank you to them. The reason, and I think getting into the detail of it now, the reason why companies are offered 40 to 60, on average 50% replacement of the energy needs with renewable energy comes down to a simple thing that I think is something most companies aren't used to, and something we don't appreciate enough. But renewable energy, and this is something that's global on it, although there's various models of this. But currently in South Africa, when it comes to renewable energy is paid for based on what is generated, not what is consumed. And I think that is the fundamental difference here that we need to take into account. So we're all comfortable with, you get your Eskom bill at the end of the month, and that is how much you are due. But I don't think it's fully appreciated that when it comes to renewable energy, you actually own a generation, or part of a generation facility somewhere, and whatever that facility puts out is what you pay for. And that comes with a whole round of risks, which we'll discuss through the paper. So starting out, diving a little bit deeper into this actual question is when it comes to renewable energy, you don't always control when the sun shines or the wind blows. That's one part that is not under your control. And the other part that's not under your control as well is the way you consume. Now, there are very large energy users in South Africa that are able to adjust their consumption based on needs, but I do think in a world where companies need to change their business operations as a result of weather patterns is not a very, very good one. So this is the fundamental issue that we need to solve. And the way the industry has approached this, and I think this is just the start of it, and there's a lot of new models coming out as we work through this. The way it was is currently being approached by the majority of the market, and we see new models emerging. But the way it's currently being handled really is to say, let's avoid those risks altogether. It's not being managed, it's avoided. And the way it's being avoided is by not giving companies a lot of energy. And the way to do that, if you look there on the left-hand side, the white line is consumption, the green is generation. If your generation is substantially less than your consumption, any variability in your consumption and any variability in your generation can be absorbed within that gap in between over a course of a year. Now, that's just two lines. There's actually three of them over a course of a year, and you need to take those into account. And eventually, I think in a number of years now, there's actually going to be 8,760 points you need to consider over a course of the year. But what you can see on the right-hand side is the reason why companies are happy to adopt this approach is that it covers, it replaces a decent amount of the dirty electricity. And given how dirty Eskom's generation is, if you can switch out 30, 40, 50% of your coal-generated energy and make a saving, it seems a bit like a no-brainer. ESG, the head of ESG is happy and the CFO is happy, and I think that makes complete sense. The question, though, that we ask, though, is this is an intermediary step to a world where we're largely going to run on renewable energy, and is this the right in the short term and the long term, or is this a short term solution that if you had the benefit of hindsight, would you have chosen the same one? So, of course, then the reason why that no more than this is actually offered is that if you actually get more, you start to get to a point where you start generating wastage, and that's when your savings start to taper off. And then, of course, if you want to get a lot more, you start generating these yellow blocks, and these yellow blocks actually result in wasted generation that you pay for but you don't consume, and your savings completely disappear. And then there, of course, there's a split between the objectives of the company in terms of emissions, and the company in terms of financial savings. So, of course, if you want to ever go to 100% on this sort of approach where you're just paying for generation, all those financial savings would disappear, and you'll actually pay a premium for renewable energy, which a few companies are happy to do given the cost of the emissions charges associated with it. So it's for this very reason that we developed the white paper, to unpack these risks and understand it. We pride ourselves on our ability to analyze data and use sort of a objective view on the information, and we built this paper on an enormous amount of data, and I'll tell you about that in a little bit. But it was also the foundation for our actual business model, because that led to our approach is on how can we actually get companies to a much, much higher level of renewable energy without generating wastage, and how do we de-risk this entire process, because I do think that by de-risking it, you unlock a bigger part of the market. So the paper, as you'll see, we cover basically the 5 primary strategies available in the market. And these are the ones that I think is the most adopted by the market. That is the embedded solar model, which basically means it's small-scale embedded generation. You might know that it's rooftop, it's land next to you, and it's 99.9% of the time it's solar. On that, luckily, the benefit of this is that it connects directly to your facilities, or it does go through your Eskom connection nearby, which allows you to, for those periods, do benefit from a bit of a relief of load shedding, but also be able to manage it yourself and have it close by. It's limited by its ability to scale, so building something really enormous is very, very difficult to do. And it also is limited by its ability to generate the best resource profile, given that the sun doesn't always shine best where you are. South Africa is blessed with amazing renewable energy resources. Yet, the difference between some locations can be quite significant. The next model, which you might be familiar with, is the wheeled solar model. This is the one where renewable energy plants are constructed in the most resource-rich parts of the country, connected to the transmission grid, and it's basically a mechanism whereby instead of buying that your generation part of your bill from Eskom, you're actually buying it from a private generator somewhere in South Africa, and it uses the grid to connect it to you, although those electrons don't actually make your way. So you can operate in Gauteng and have a farm in the Western Cape, as long as it's being accounted for on a national basis. Similarly, you have the wheeled wind model. Now, wind is a little bit more difficult to achieve, and it's quite a rare asset at this point in time, just given that it's very location specific. Next to that is the aggregator or trader model. Now, this model operates as a mechanism to largely act as an intermediary between the wheeled solar and the wheeled wind model. So instead of giving you a full plant, you are given a share of one or multiple plants on that. So one, as a business, benefits from potential diversification of generation, but also from the scale of having the trader or the aggregator build a bigger plant than what is needed and having multiple off-takers on the other side. It also allows businesses to take variable contractual terms. So while the models on the left-hand side are usually 15 to 25-year contracts, the trader and the aggregator model allows you to take a shorter-term view up to a certain level. And then, of course, there's the product model on the right-hand side, which is trying to change. Instead of passing through the actual generation profiles or that part of it, what it does is it sells energy as a product. So it is an entity in the middle that takes risk, puts up its balance sheet to procure the energy, and doesn't pass on specific profiles on it, but pass on energy as a solution or a product based on a consumption profile on that side. And that is the right-hand side, the product model. We looked at roughly 17 industries, but we honed down on 7 unique industries, as we found that these profiles are different across all of these, and hence you can get different results. So, multiple ones fall under these, but it's mining, financial services, food, retail, fitness, hospitality, entertainment, agriculture, and shopping center. And the one thing the paper does, and it focuses on, is to say, we've got all these strategies, you've got all these different industries, all these different profiles. Which strategy gives you the maximum? Which strategy is best for you to maximize your financial savings and coverage today and in the long term? So importantly, we added in the long term, because there's a lot of risks and uncertainty as we go longer term. And of course, as you know, with renewable energy, the longer contract you take, the bigger your savings today. But you've got to take into account the long-term risks that you're exposed to that goes alongside that. So a big focus for us is on the long-term consequences. So the paper looks at basically 5 scenarios, and we call these almost stages. As what we found when we spoke to a lot of our partners is this is the approach they take with procuring renewable energy. So the first stage one is basically the point of wasted generation. So how much generation can you take for each industry based on all the different strategies that gets to the point where you generate your first wasted electron, and that could be in a month of December for standard time, for example. Stage 2, which gets a little bit more complicated, is where you still get additional renewable energy renewable energy. You increase your coverage, but your savings start to taper off. So it's the point of where marginal gains start to decline and eventually turn to losses. So it gets to the point of where you maximize your financial saving for a certain level of coverage. So finds the point where the curve, any additional energy would result in decrease of it, which we believe is the optimal point to go for at this point in time if you approach it from a financial point of view. Not necessarily from an ESG point of view, but definitely from a financial one, if you're thinking of a pure electron cost. And then stage 3 on the right-hand side is to say, once you've reached that point, how do these strategies compare to different stresses? To say, what if generation is not as expected, consumption changes, or the price of the utility changes. Now, that is important given that the more renewable energy you take, the less exposed you are to Eskom. So say, for example, you take 50% renewable energy, that other 50% is still exposed to big increase. And if you saw the news recently, there are hints of a very, very big increase coming in the short term as Eskom applied for the increase for next year to NERSA. So a big consideration, particularly in the long term, is around how you see that Eskom price changing over the next decade or 2 decades, and how does that impact your decision at any point in time. And the last 2 things that we did, and I think this is very, very valuable and important for everyone to take into account, because we see this, we speak to experts and everyone understands that this is likely to happen, and likely to have a big impact, and we want to understand how robust each strategy is. So stress 1 is looking at a national excess solar scenario, which is looking like a very likely, all models predict that will be the case on this, and what's the consequences for each strategy on that. And then the last one we look at is what if the carbon taxes, specifically around electricity, come into play, both from a CBAM point of view and a local point of view, and how that is impacting. It's particularly relevant to South Africa, given that we have an enormous export market, and the goods that we do export are those that are generally very taxable internationally from a carbon point of view. So we do think that's very relevant to understand. So just on the data side, we looked at an enormous amount of data, and this continues to grow every single day. So we looked at 58 businesses, roughly 343 buildings or sites or mines or smelters or points of connection on that, covering 17 industries, roughly 17 million 30-minute intervals of data we get from both our clients, and we got a big data, a lot of data from Eskom on this. We also looked at roughly 36 terawatts of energy that we analyzed on that. And of course, then we match it with 20 different generation facilities scattered across the country. So a data set that I think is quite strong, and one we continue to build on as we go through. So turning to the first part of the analysis, and this is that first point of wasted generation. So what we found in the paper is, if the mandate for any company, or if you think about the stages that a company goes through from a procurement point of view, the point of where generation starts to get wasted is very different by each strategy and how it comes through. So if you think, given that you're paying for generation and you're not paying for consumption, each of these strategies yield a different one. And we see actually there's a big range depending on which industry you're in, given that each industry has a different time of use, energy distribution, so different amounts during the day, different. Some businesses run at night, some businesses are very peak heavy, so you can see the differentiation here. So the embedded solar model is one that was quite interesting for us, and the reason for that really is the complexity that comes through, given that the embedded solar model by definition runs on a almost real-time basis. So what I mean by that is the wheeled and the wheeled models, and the product model and the trader models all benefit from something currently in the market called banking, which means that energy generated on 1 January can be used on the 31st of January, and within that same time period. When it comes to the embedded model in particular, unfortunately, the way that works is that if that energy is generated within that second, or within that, without battery storage, it has to be consumed, which basically indicated to us that that is an enormous amount of wastage. So given that point is very, very low on the actual analysis on this. But it came very clear, and it sort of reinforced our earlier analysis that companies are being offered 50% on average for a replacement of their energy consumption. And it's quite strong there. The trader model and the wheeled models all yield sort of the same result, depending on which combination you use. I think the only one that really stands out here, and that's just the way it is designed, is of course the product model, which allows you to achieve 90%, because it's by definition does not at that level offer any wastage, and that is evacuated. Next up is the point, second point on it, and this is really the point of maximum financial savings. This is one we think every company should strive to achieve, given that you're still generating wastage, but you're still making financial savings and increasing your coverage. So what we looked at is to say for each different industry, what is the optimal model in this? And we were quite interested, surprised actually to see the results really coming in. And what we see here from the different industries is there's really two models that come out very, very strongly. The third and fourth model is the wheeled wind and trader model, but the product and the wheeled solar model came out very, very strongly. So the coverage that generally gets offered here is the maximum you can really go with solar, even while you're generating wastage, is roughly 75%, depending on the strategy. And you can generate an enormous amount of return over, say, a 10-year period. Of course, it'll be much bigger over the longer term. But what you can see, though, is that these two strategies do stand out really from a procurement point of view in terms of the financial savings that they generate. The reason why solar is you're able to generate or have so much wasted solar, and this is something we found very interesting, is purely just based on the cost of solar at this point in time. Given that solar is reasonably priced at the moment, the ability to absorb wastage at this point in time and have that wasted amount allows you to take a lot more on it. Of course, it changes completely as you go to higher levels of coverage. So in the paper, you always also see what if you ever want to get to 90 with solar, what is required to do that. And the trick with solar really is, given that it doesn't work at night. You might ask, how can you ever reach more than, say, 50%? The reason is that solar generates on weekends as well, and daytime during the weekend, based on the current Eskom model, can be used at nighttime during the week and be accounted for based on that banking mechanism that I spoke about. So, a Saturday and a Sunday, Saturday morning still stand up at, say, a Sunday, you can actually generate solar during the day and use it or count for it in the nighttime during the week. Now, of course, if you have one windy Sunday, it really impacts your results here. I mean, one cloudy Sunday. But it sort of speaks to the ability to do that. Should that model change where you can bank in the future, of course, this all falls away. But based on the current regulations, this is the model that this results from what generates the most coverage and financial savings. A question we got, and this was a guidance by the large energy user group that we did engage in, lots of companies within that, is what about a strategy that involves using solar first and then wind thereafter? And we do get this question a lot, and the paper actually looks at that specifically. The argument really for that is to say, let's maximize our financial savings and let's use wind to cover the rest. Now, the problem with that, if you look on the left-hand side there, is based on the average company's profile. Currently, you get off-peak, standard, and peak time. Off-peak is nighttime and weekends, and public holiday. Standard is really in the middle of the day, and peak, of course, is rush hour traffic time, early morning and early evening. After you've taken solar, I think the big realization out of this for us was, a lot of companies think a megawatt or a kilowatt is a kilowatt, really, and doesn't matter when it's generated. When it's generated is critically important. So after taking into account solar, what basically happens to a company's consumption profile is they become enormously off-peak heavy. And unfortunately, currently in the world, really, there's no renewable energy asset that only works at night and doesn't work in the day. So the best match you can get really is, of course, wind. But the problem with wind, though, is it still works during the day. So the amount of wastage that you generate as a result of the strategy is still quite substantial. So once you've got solar and then wind, it doesn't allow you to avoid wastage. You're actually still going to have an enormous amount of it. And this was very interesting for us on it. The next, which I think is an important scenario to look at, and I did allude to it a little bit earlier, is a future of excess national solar. So this is in California, this is in Australia, and currently Eskom accounts for roughly 5.2 gigawatts of embedded solar installed in South Africa, which is absolutely incredible and really testament to South Africans making a plan during load shedding last year. I think it was a 3.5 times increase in rooftop installations last year. It's really it was really remarkable. And I think it's a big driver of the reduced load shedding we're all enjoying at this point in time. But importantly is we need to take into account the consequence of that. Now, the consequence is we have a few case studies for that, where, say, California during the day, currently there's excess solar. In Australia, there's excess solar. And actually in those markets, what we're seeing now today is that not only is electricity free, but there's so much excess that it's actually turned to certain times to negative prices, which basically means that the wholesale prices that the national system, the national provider, is incentivizing, paying companies to please use electricity during that time instead of later, to try and encourage economic growth, but also to encourage a shift away from the peak in the night times where things are very expensive at that time. So it's a very, very interesting result. Now, what that means basically for all of these strategies is if you are very standard heavy, daytime heavy, if that does happen, or even if there's a decrease in the standard price, because you're paying for generation and the price is fixed. If Eskom or the national provider drops to, say, 50 cents and you have contracted for a R1 standard time price, you're basically operating at a loss. Now, what usually happens in this space is, given that there's a lot of fixed costs in the system, what happens is your daytime prices fall and your nighttime and peak time prices increase. And we've actually seen, if you look at the application papers by Eskom to NERSA on this, we see a future already where standard prices are either going to drop or stay the same, while off-peak and nighttime prices, peak and off-peak prices, nighttime and peak prices are actually going to increase. So we already see a rebalancing on the horizon for this. We looked at the impact of this tariff, impact of a tariff rebalance. So what would happen if, for example, we have excess solar and you have to do the standard time in South Africa decreases and off-peak time increases. The interesting thing that came out here is, while the wheeled solar model is very efficient in the current status quo, it wasn't very robust to this change at all, as you probably can expect. Wind, of course, a bit better. The trade and aggregator model more or less the same, given the balance of it. Of course, the product model in this situation, given that you charge the price really on a time of use basis, it's not a fixed price over the course of the time, is that once off-peak goes up and peak goes down from a national utility point of view, you're kind of immunized from those savings, which I think is a very, very positive result around it, because you make more money on the off-peak side and you make less money on or potentially a loss on the standard times, but quite protected on that basis. Next up, and you'll see this in the paper, and I think this is actually, if you do dive deep into this, a helpful way to analyze the various strategies. So, we often speak to companies where, it's not about how much can I get. It is, I have a target of being 50% renewable energy by a certain date. And what you can actually do here is, in the papers, you can use these graphs to determine for a particular industry, and we can do this for any industry, is to determine what is almost pricing curves or effective price curves. What is the strategy that yields the most financial savings for a certain level of renewable energy coverage? And what came out here really is that you can see what percentage you want to get to and what strategy is best for it. But you can also see another important thing is what happens if you ever want to get more on that. So it kind of shows you can see the embedded graph, the yellow one on the left-hand side there. You can never get more than 40 to 45% more or less without paying it. And if you wanted to get more, you're going to pay enormously for your electricity. So the gray line there that's flat is you always want to be below the Eskom line. On the wheeled solar, you can go to roughly 50 to 60%, but then going anywhere more on that results in an enormous loss and savings on that. So, if you feel, I think if a company feels that 50 to 60% renewable energy coverage is all we need for the next 20 years, that's fine. But I do think it's a bit of a dangerous view, given where the world is going in terms of taxing or putting pressure on companies to change their emissions footprint. And then you can see the various ones. Of course, wheeled wind doesn't give you as much of a saving given the price difference, but it allows you to achieve a much higher level of coverage, of course. And then the platform model, given that there is no, it's 90 to 100% or nothing really on that, allows you to achieve savings and a high coverage level associated with that. Importantly, what these graphs also allow us to do is to say every one of these strategies have got a different level of remaining energy running on Eskom. And we can able to model how do these curves move up and down based on what happens to Eskom, because the further to the right you are as a business, the more protected you are against variations in Eskom's price, above CPI. So what you can actually see in the next slide is that it's complex, but to show you that the more renewable energy you take, the less variation there is around the curve, depending on what happens to Eskom. So to give you an idea, if Eskom goes at, say, CPI plus 5, which is less than what we've seen over the recent years, and definitely less than we've seen over the last 5, I think the current stat is roughly CPI plus 5.5 to 6 for the last 10 years. If we take that into account, you can see that each of these strategies, your decision that you would have made in terms of which is optimal, changes considerably. So you need to take into account your view, and each company has their own view of the future. On this, we can model variations of it, so you can get CPI plus 3, CPI plus 1.5, CPI plus 5%. I do think these are reasonable on these, but you can sort of look at your own assumptions and interpolate here. But you can see how the further you are to the left-hand side, the more variable your total cost of energy becomes as a result of this. So renewable energy has the benefit of immunizing you against these changes, but the amount that you take determines your level of immunization or protection against this. Next up is something that I think the market really underappreciates, and something that we really got stuck into. So if you ever looked at renewable energy procurement, there's often a word being thrown around, which is a P50 around it. So P50 is basically saying that there's a 50% chance that your energy will be at least this level, or the plant will deliver at least this energy. Now, one thing that's was a bit of a realization for us is P50s are usually quoted on an annual basis. So annual variability is quite low and quite stable on that. So if you look there on the left-hand side, between years, you might see a -7 to +7% change in the amount of energy you get. Wind, of course, is a little bit more on the variation side. But unfortunately, you're not buying energy on an annual basis. You're actually buying energy on a monthly basis, which means that you need to actually take into account a month. Going a little bit more technical on this, is actually 36 points that you need to take into account, not 12. I said 12 months because there's 36 different times, peak off, peak and standard in every month. So you need to take that variability into account. But basically what it means, though, is that for a particular generation profile, and we've spoken to some clients who've done, have had a year or two of renewable energy delivery to this. And one thing that is always comes out is we're not nearly getting what we expected, or it's completely variable attached to that. Now, you can see on wind, the variability is absolutely enormous if you had to take into account 80% confidence interval, and of course solar as well. So the variability is something that I think should be really appreciated to this, because as I mentioned earlier, you pay for what is generated. So if the sun shines more than expected or less, or the wind blows more than expected, you are required to pay for that energy, unless you manage to agree some sort of cap or limit to that. The consequence of this on the right-hand side is that the appeal of the various strategies taking into account some generation volatility. So the order of those strategies change dramatically. Suddenly, I think and we're advocating for the product model here, but the product model itself becomes a lot more robust here, given that variability is not passed on it. And interestingly, on the right-hand side, what was previously your ability to take a lot of solar up to 75%, suddenly the best strategy is to take very little solar on that, because that variability will generate a lot of wastage. So it shows you how the dynamics change, take into account, say, a variable generation profile. But that is not the only variability that we have to deal with and manage on that. I think the other variability, which is also very underappreciated, is consumption variability. So we managed to get years and years of data. We got this both from Eskom and individual companies on a very, very granular basis. And one thing that was interesting for us is often companies tell us that their consumption is completely flat on that, which I think is in some cases true, but often what we found is that there's enormous volatility. So on the left-hand side, there you see two companies in the same industry having completely different profiles. That can happen. It doesn't happen very often, but they can happen on that. In the middle, you look at an industry where someone says that we're always using electricity at around about this level, but we saw about a 200% difference, during the December-January period to its peak during the year, which is absolutely enormous on that. And then, of course, things can go wrong and things can happen. We looked at the COVID-19 shutdown and the pandemic and what happened there, and you look at a company before and after COVID for a given year. What you can actually see is, something like that happens and your consumption drops by 40%. Now, taking into account that drop means that given that you're paying for generation and not consumption, it results in a lot of risk and volatility for those sort of models that need to be taken into account. So if you go through that process, you need to take on that energy, and I think that's critical. Another view, another way to look at it is just the volatility or the variability of consumption on this. I think when we speak to a lot of the mining industry, you do expect them, and we were quite surprised at that the consumption would be completely stable. Ironically, it's financial services that are very, very consistent in their consumption, and you can see it. But if you compare that to mining is generally quite stable. But what unfortunately happens in the mining industry is that there's scheduled maintenance periods, which can often result in a 30 to 40% drop for a given 2-week period, which is substantial. So if you take that into account, and you take a lot of renewable energy, there's a big risk of paying for generation that you don't consume. So out of this paper, we do conclude which strategies we think is most optimal from a financial savings maximization. So if you take into account, from a pure no variability situation, I think it is depending on which industry it is a close horse race between the product model and the wheeled solar model in terms of maximizing financial savings. But once you start taking into account absorbing volatility and variability, whether it's generation or consumption, the product model does come out strongly, given that it has the ability to evacuate and absorb excess power on that basis. A big case, and thank you for listening, is around the platform model. And I want to just thought I'd illustrate this to you, why we think it's important. So there's two forms of there's a very simple way to deal with volatility and variation and wastage, and it's called diversification. It's basically the law of large numbers here. If you can decrease volatility and variability as a result of increasing the number of companies, and importantly also being very selective around the companies that you bring on, not focusing overly on any particular sector. So what you can see here is to say, if you look at a single industry on its own, on average, the amount they can take is roughly 50%, called as 49%, before they generate wastage on a 50 wind, 50 solar basis in this case. Of course, though, if you're very selective around the industries and you increase those industries, you can see that that point of wastage increases enormously. And this makes really a big case for a portfolio of companies coming together and buying renewable energy, which is basically what the product model, the platform model is trying to do, is to say, let's bring in intentionally a number of different diverse industries, and allows you to actually get to a very high level without wastage. And this is the foundation beyond the platform model on this. And of course, what you're able to do though as well is, if you combine it correctly, you can basically combine all these industries on the right-hand side and get to the same consumption variability of a financial services provider, which is which I think is a very, very good result, as you're able to diversify that away. A final point I'd like to just iterate on this, because I do think this is relevant and important for everyone looking at this industry. A question that we often get asked, and we often present to various excos at companies as part of our process of engaging companies around our model. We take them through basically the various pros and cons of our product, but there's always a lot of questions that come in, a lot of uncertainty around this market, and the question that comes up is should we wait, or should we take a short-term view? And while no one can predict the future, you can analyze what needs to happen in order for you to justify your waiting time. So basically what we did in this paper as well, in a section we added in, which I think is helpful, is we look at what is the cost of delay, because the cost of delay is basically lost savings. It's an opportunity cost. So by delaying, you're missing on savings today. So yes, you might be buying it at a lower price later, but you've given up on savings today, which is risky. So the question is, what level of drop is required in the price of renewables to justify the delay? And I'll get to that now. Importantly, just something to take into account before we show the actual analysis is when people say the price of renewables is going down, that is absolutely true. Up until bid window 5. So we use this as the government procurement prices as a good indicator of what is bankable, because a lot of people can give you prices, but it's not bankable, i.e. they won't be able to get the project built. So these are bankable projects on this, and you can actually see how the prices have come down on this. Of course, the prices here are a lot lower than in the corporate space, given that you have a treasury guarantee and a lot of risk mitigation. So there's a lot of benefits of selling to government, given that energy is paid for, and whether or not the government takes it or not, it's a lot more. It's a very, very good program on that. So if Eskom takes it, if you generate it, Eskom pays for it. There's a lot of benefits to it. So what you can see is the price has come down. Solar has come down dramatically, but we're seeing a turn in the price of it. So and the reason really for that, and the reason why the marginal decreases are coming down, is because originally bid window 1, bid window 2, the technology element of the project, building these multi-billion rand wind and solar farms, the technology element of it constituted roughly 80 to 90% of the total project cost, which means that if you're able to get a 10 to 20% saving, the majority of that saving on the technology side gets passed through. However, today, if you look at sort of a solar plant, if you think about the core technology, which is the wafers within that, our data provided by a few companies for us, it comes to between, say, 35 to 45%, depending on the project, of the cost. So the other 60% is aluminium, steel, cement, wiring, labor, land, etc., which aren't subject to the same technological innovations on that. So hence you see that sort of bottoming out and flattening out of costs on this. And we're fairly comfortable that, given that our own projects, we are taking a multi-decade view on those projects, because we believe that decreases in renewable energy based on the current technologies is limited, unfortunately. So it's interesting. And then, of course, on the right-hand side, which needs to be taken into account, is the price of renewable energy is very much a function of the quality of the resources that are there. So the difference between a good and a bad wind farm could be 10 to 20% in terms of the cost of renewable energy. So locations are very important, and as important is, of course, the ability to connect projects to the grid. Now, there's a lot of comments around grid access in South Africa and how that is becoming more and more difficult. Currently, internationally, we're currently in a very good spot still. Currently, internationally, if you want to connect a new project, the average wait time is anywhere between 5 and 15 years, depending on Europe, UK, US, where you go. So the ability to procure renewable energy is becoming a much, much longer process on that. So even though you want to delay, once you've taken that decision to procure, you might still have to wait half a decade before you actually get that energy. So there is a cost and a risk around delaying procurement. Importantly, what you'll see in the paper as well is what we do is we quantify how much price of renewable energy in totality, not the technology price, which is a subset of it, the total price, i.e. the cost of cement, the cost of steel, the cost of labor, the cost of the underlying technology. How much does that have to drop by to justify a delay or justify a short-term contract? And the answer to that is no one knows what's going to happen in the future, but I think you can say, based on your own assumptions, that if the price of the total renewable energy dropped by 20% over the next 5 years, would it justify? So what we find is a simple rule of thumb to say that for every 5 years delay, you need the price of renewable energy to drop for a 5-year contract by 20%, which is quite substantial and something we think is very unlikely to play out in the market on that. So, and every 10 years for a 10-year contract, roughly a 40%. So if you say, listen, I'm going to sit and wait, you need the prices to drop dramatically to justify that delay on that. And I think it's a helpful way to just understand, if there's caution around the future of renewable energy, it's not your view. It shouldn't be taken as your view of just the price of renewable technology, but the view of the lost savings you're missing out today and the cost of delayed grid access on that. And then, of course, the paper looks at one other important thing that I think is relevant to a number of companies on this call. We all know South Africa's got very dirty electricity. I'm not sure everyone knew that it's the dirtiest in the world. It's just the nature of the economy, and I think it's been a driver of real economic growth for us. But I think in a world where we need to compete globally, and today competition is not just on price. Well, it is on price, but price now includes emissions on that. We're about half where the global average or the global median is. So if we want to compete with exporting materials or goods or selling goods internationally, this is going to mean a cost to businesses in South Africa, and you have to lower your price or find ways to generate cheaper on this. So there's two consequences of this. One is carbon taxes in South Africa is currently in play, although you need to admit a certain amount in order to pay for it. But it's been legislated to increase at an enormous rate, or double in the next 7 years, as well as potential limits of who qualifies being lowered so that more companies qualify and pay for this. And this is going to be a expense on this. The other one that is coming, though, and I'm sure many companies here on this call have looked at that, is of course CBAM on it. Currently, CBAM only taxes electricity on cement and fertilizer, although it's expected that it would apply to basically all exports eventually. So basically what it means is the EU and the US are trying to, the US not CBAM, just EU is CBAM, but the US expected to adopt something similar. They are trying to level the playing field so that its local companies have, and any exports have to have the same emissions profile to compete on a like-for-like basis for imports or in that part. Unfortunately, what that means, though, is given every company is different, but basically in the EU, what we're seeing, though, is about 8 times different than the tax rate currently being paid for this, which means that if you take into account the carbon taxes and that, if you want to export to Europe, you're probably going to have to pay 8 times that based on the current prices on that. So I think it's just a big risk for companies now. Many industries might not be impacted this, in the short term, but I do think it's important to decarbonize quickly on an electricity front, specifically given that grid access is limited, to get going on that basis. So 5 key takeaways, I think, hopefully from the paper. I really appreciate everyone listening here on this call. I think one thing we realize is businesses must be careful of short-term gain strategies. This is long-term robust ones, and hopefully the paper can give some insights to this. We must appreciate how unique renewable energy is compared to the way we currently consume electricity, and the risk that each model presents on that basis. The volatility in all forms, whether it's Eskom, whether it's generation, whether it's consumption, should be appreciated and should be taken into account. I think from the analysis we showed that both from a financial point of view, the wheel solar and platform models offer the greatest benefit from a financial point of view, with a platform model providing the most protection. And lastly, and I hope this point is very clear to everyone on this, is we do think the opportunity cost of delaying must be considered more strongly in the strategies of businesses as they work through this process. So I'd thank you very, very much for listening. I really appreciate it.